Hi everybody, demand in economics is defined like this. Demand is the quantity of a good or service consumers are willing and able to buy at a given price in a given time period. That definition is very important. Learn it word for word. Demand has to be effective in economics for it to exist. By effective, consumers have to be both willing and able to buy something for there to be demand in economics. Demand has to be effective, we call it. Consumers are willing and able. Now, when we study demand in economics, there is a very interesting pattern of behavior when consumers spend their money. And that is known as the law of demand, this pattern. And the law of demand simply states that there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. What does that mean? It means that as the price increases, quantity demanded decreases, whereas if the price decreases, quantity demanded increases. There is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. When price goes one way, quantity demanded goes the other way. And we can show that relationship on a diagram using a demand curve like this. Now, whenever we draw these curves, we say curves, but they're just linear downward sloping lines for simplicity purposes. We must label the axis correct. We're showing the relationship between price and quantity demanded here. So price and quantity goes on the axis. Price on the y, quantity on the x. Our demand curve, therefore, is downward sloping because that shows the inverse relationship here. Now we can put all of this onto a diagram. So let's take an initial price. So at a price of P1, quantity demanded there is at Q1. Let's show this inverse relationship, this law of demand. So as the price increases, so let's say from P1 to P2, this demand curve shows the inverse relationship. Quantity demand has decreased from Q1 to Q2. And similarly, if price decreases, let's say from P1 to P3, we can see that there is an increase in quantity demanded from Q1 to Q3. So the demand curve here clearly shows us this relationship. This is a demand curve in economics. It clearly illustrates the law of demand. Now, to understand this law and to get to this law, we make a fundamental assumption. We assume ceteris paribus when the price changes. Ceteris paribus means all other factors remain unchanged. All other things remain equal. That's what ceteris paribus means. And by having that assumption, we can get to the law of demand as a theory. We can isolate the impact of price changes and see exactly the impact it has on quantity demanded, on demand itself. So when price changes, to actually get to this law of demand theory, we make this assumption, which means that we move along the curve, guys. So when we increase price, we move along the curve, and that is called a contraction of demand. That's very important. A contraction of demand. Whereas when we decrease the price, we see an increase in quantity demanded. That's called an extension of demand. An extension of demand. Another name for that is also an expansion of demand. But you see, we move along the curve when we change price, assuming ceteris paribus here. All other factors remain unequal. Anything else that can affect demand remains unchanged. So when prices go up or down, there is a change in quantity demanded shown by a movement along the demand curve. Very important. That's how we show the change in demand there. So that's all well and good. We understand the law of demand. We understand that there is this inverse relationship. When prices go up, quantity demand goes down. There is a contraction of demand. When prices go down, quantity demanded increases. There is an extension of demand. We move down the demand curve. Fine. But why? Why is there this downward slope? What explains the inverse relationship? Well, there are two effects that explain it. The income effect and the substitution effect. Let's take a price increase in both cases. How does the income effect explain that when prices go up, there is a contraction of demand? There is a fall in quantity demanded. Well, very simply, as prices go up, our income can't stretch as far. The purchasing power of our income can't go as far. Therefore, we are less able to buy. Our income maybe doesn't allow us to buy the same quantity of goods and services as before. So our demand contracts. We demand less. That's the income effect. What about the substitution effect? Why, as prices go up, do we demand less according to the substitution effect? Well, as prices go up, other goods and services become more price competitive. So we switch our demand, we switch our consumption towards buying those goods and services instead, which is why demand contracts for this good or service, and there is a decrease from Q1 to Q2. The opposite for a decrease in price, the income effect and the substitution effect, can still explain why, as prices fall, quantity demanded increases. Our income stretches further, and other goods and services become less competitive, which is why we demand more of this one. So we understand the basic law of demand. When price increases, quantity demanded decreases. It contracts and we move up the demand curve. If price decreases, quantity demanded increases. It extends and we move down the demand curve. That's the basic law of demand, the inverse relationship, assuming ceteris paribus. But we know that there are clearly other factors that can affect our demand, not just price. When we drop the assumption of ceteris paribus, we can allow non-price factors to affect demand. How do we show the impact of that on a diagram? Well, let's have a look. Non-price factors will shift the demand curve, as this diagram clearly shows here. So if a non-price factor that affects demand increases demand, the demand curve will shift to the right from D1 to D2. Whereas if a non-price factor reduces our demand, the demand curve will shift to the left from D1 to D3. But crucially, these non-price factors affect demand completely independent of price. So at the same price, you can see here that if the demand curve shifts to the right, there is more demand. If the demand curve shifts to the left, there is less demand at the same price. So what are these non-price factors that can affect our demand independent of price? Well, just remember Pacific. I've spelt it wrong on purpose, so then it all fits together. So Pacific with an S, but it works. So just remember Pacific. What are these factors then that can shift the demand curve independent of price? Well, population clearly can affect demand. If there is a greater population, there'll be more demand for a certain good or service. The demand curve will shift to the right from D1 to D2. Whereas if population decreases, there'll be less demand from D1 to D3, independent of price. Advertising, good advertising affects our willingness to buy something. So good advertising will shift the demand curve from D1 to D2, increasing demand from Q1 to Q2, regardless of the price. Whereas if there is bad advertising, so maybe a bad report or a bad news article about something, the demand curve will shift left as we become less willing to buy. From D1 to D3, the demand curve will shift. Substitutes price. What is a substitute? A substitute is a good that's a rival good to something else, or it's a good that's in competition with something else. So a good example of substitutes, classic example, Coke and Pepsi. Clearly substitute goods that are in rival competition with each other. So let's say this is the demand curve for Coke. If the price of Pepsi goes up, more people are going to be willing and able to buy Coke instead. That's going to shift the demand curve for Coke from D1 to D2. Whereas if the price of Pepsi, a substitute, goes down, more people want to buy Pepsi, less people will be willing and able to buy Coke, decreasing demand from D1 to D3, shifting the demand curve to the left from D1 to D3 here. What about income? Well, when it comes to income, we need to make a distinction between normal goods and inferior goods. Normal goods are, as incomes rise, demand for them will increase. So take things like luxury cars, take things like fine dining or restaurant dining, things like designer clothing. These are all classic examples of normal goods. When our income goes up, demand for them will shift to the right from D1 to D2. Whereas when our income decreases, demand for cars, demands for restaurant dining, demand for designer clothing will all decrease, will shift to the left from D1 to D3. Inferior goods, though, have the opposite relationship. Inferior goods are, as incomes go up, demand for them will decrease. Whereas when incomes go down, demand for them will increase. What are some examples of inferior goods? Things like fast food, public transport, holidaying at home. These are all good examples of inferior goods. So for inferior goods, as income goes up, the demand for these inferior goods will shift to the left from D1 to D3. Whereas when incomes go down, demand will increase, will shift to the right from D1 to D2. So when we think income, always think first, is it a normal good or an inferior good? And therefore, if incomes rise or fall, you know which way the demand curve will shift. Fashion and taste clearly will affect demand, will affect our willingness and potentially our ability to buy, but certainly our willingness. If fashion changes towards a certain good or service, it's going to make us buy more of it, it's going to make us demand more of it at the same price, shifting the demand curve to the right from D1 to D2. Whereas if fashion moves away from a good or service, the demand curve for the good will shift to the left from D1 to D3. Interest rates can really affect the demand for goods or services if consumers need to borrow in order to buy it. So take goods like housing, cars, for example, maybe even holidays, jewellery, furniture. These are all goods and services that consumers tend to borrow money in order to buy. So if interest rates go down, it makes it cheaper for consumers to borrow, which will increase the demand for these goods or services. Whereas if interest rates go up, it makes it more expensive to borrow. That will reduce the demand for these goods and services, shifting the demand curve from D1 to D3. Whereas if interest rates fall, demand for goods where consumers need to borrow and buy will increase from D1 to D2. we've also got the complements price. What is a complement? A complementary good is a good that's often bought with another. So let's take printer ink. Printer ink is a complement to printers. You buy printers first and then you often buy printer ink. So let's say that the price of printers goes up. Well, if the price of printers goes up, the demand for printer ink will shift to the left. It's not the price of printer ink that's changed, it's the price of printers that's changed, which causes the demand curve for printer ink to shift to the left in this case. Whereas if the price of printers went down, the demand for printer ink would shift to the right. The demand curve would shift to the right from D1 to D2. So that's a complements price, the idea that the price of a complement can shift demand for another good, either to the right or to the left. So that covers demand theory fully. Crucially, a movement along the curve will happen if the price of the good itself changes, whereas if non-price factors affect demand for a good or service, then we show a shift of the demand curve like this. So get practicing with all these non-price factors, know Pacific well, make sure you take all this down, practice it, master it, become amazing at it, and stay tuned for the next very important video where we do the same stuff for supply and the supply curve. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.